I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection,
The Democratic leader and I have had an opportunity to have a discussion, and it leads to the following. We'll now cast a vote on the witness question, and once that vote is complete, I would ask that the Senate stand in recess, subject to call of the chair.
thank you. Without objection, so ordered. The question is, shall it be in order to consider and debate under the impeachment rules any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents? The yeas and nays are required under Senate Resolution 483. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander? No. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? No. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mrs. Blackburn? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blunt? No. Mr. Booker? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Braun? No. Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Burr? No. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mrs. Capito? No. Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Cassidy? No. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye. Mr. Cotton? No. Mr. Kramer? No. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Daines? No. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Enzi? No. Ms. Ernst? Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Gardner? No. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Graham? No. Mr. Grassley? No. Ms. Harris? Aye. Ms. Hassan? Aye. Mr. Hawley? No. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mr. Hoven? No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? No. Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Jones? Aye. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Kennedy? No. Mr. King? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Langford? No. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mrs. Loeffler? No. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. McConnell? No. Ms. McSally? No. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Moran? No. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Perdue? No. Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Portman? No. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Roberts? No. Mr. Romney? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Rounds? No. Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Sass? No. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? No. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Shelby? No. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Smith? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Sullivan? No. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Tillis? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
All right, well, that's it. History has just been made. The very important motion to get witnesses and new evidence allowed in this trial of the President of the United States fails 51-49. Not a surprise. We anticipated that only 2 Republicans would vote in favor, Susan Collins and Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
And as a result, it didn't get what they needed. They needed 51 in order to pass it. They had 51 opposed.
And when you step away from the move to remove President Trump from office, which it's difficult to do because that's the context of all of this, and you step away from whatever qualms people might have about the way that the House impeachment managers have conducted their case or how the House Democrats conducted the impeachment, just looking at this motion, okay, and what this motion was doing, which would allow subpoenas for further witnesses or further documents, it is striking that there is a national security advisor for President Trump, John Bolton, who is out there basically waving his hands and saying, I would like to be subpoenaed, I would like to testify. He has a manuscript, and according to the New York Times, in that manuscript, he claims to have had conversations with President Trump in which Trump asserts a quid pro quo. They cannot have this military aid, security aid, $391 million worth, unless, according to this New York Times story, unless they deliver on these investigations into the Bidens. In addition to that, you have the president's former chief of staff, John Kelly, retired Marine general, rock rib Republican, out there talking to people saying, I think that the Senate should call new witnesses. I believe John Bolton, even if President Trump denies this. And even in that context, the Senate voted the way they did, with every Republican except for Susan Collins and Mitt Romney saying, I don't need to hear anymore. Some of them even saying, even if you believe what John Bolton is saying, and even if you believe the quid pro quo, it's not enough to remove somebody from office.
And Gloria, it's clear that 51-49 against witnesses. Hold on a moment.
Schumer's speaking right now. Let's listen in.
A witness, a document. No witnesses, no documents in an impeachment trial is a perfidy. It's a grand tragedy, one of the worst tragedies that the Senate has ever overcome. America will remember this day, unfortunately, where the Senate did not live up to its responsibilities, where the Senate turned away from truth and went along with a sham trial. This, if the president is acquitted with no witnesses, no documents, the acquittal will have no value, because Americans will know that this trial was not a real trial. It had no witnesses, no documents. It is a tragedy on a very large scale. I will be now going up to my caucus to discuss what we're doing next. I will not talk about it here. Okay? Thanks.